Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
Hello. Long before the No King's Day parades, demonstrations, protests in the United States in June and in October 2025, there was the gradual rise of hybrid authoritarianism with the advent of the neoliberal political economy in the late 1970s in Chile, the United Kingdom. Chile, by the way, was the testing country where neoliberalism was taking place under the aegis of the United States government, as well as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Neoliberalism is essentially the political economy rooted in corporate welfare and the elimination to the highest degree possible or at least if not the total elimination, the diminution, the downgrading of the social welfare state based on Keynesian economics. Hybrid authoritarianism simply means that that the regime is based on electoral politics. There is an electoral process, and voters are granted the right to choose among political parties. However, the policies pursued once the political parties take over are some form that includes neoliberal policies which lead to authoritarian measures. And that includes, by the way, but it's not limited to, strengthening the executive branch, what scholars call in the United States unitary executive theory, which means that the power is amassed illegally, by the way, in the hands of the executive to the detriment of the legislative branch, whose job is, specifically in the United States, but in many countries, to control the purse strings, that is how money is distributed, because the role of the state is that of redistributing income in society through the fiscal structure, that is through taxation, as well as monetary policy, as well as investment policy, trade policy, labor policy. That's the role of the state. So strengthening the executive at the expense of the legislative branch, which is much more representative, representing the people at the local level, state and local level, is one element of it. The other element is replacing the liberal democracy norms based on a country's constitution, as reflected in the constitution, at least in theory, with a new norm of authoritarian policies that are implemented in practice. And that specifically means doing away with all elements of pluralism, diversity, equity and inclusion and social justice. Those terms are an anathema to neoliberal authoritarians, by the way, who project themselves as being part of a democratic process, but in essence, they are all part of hybrid authoritarianism. The other element of hybrid authoritarianism includes the crushing of the labor class, the working class, as well as the middle class during a process where there is a gradual, massive transfer of income from the bottom up to serve the elites, and at the same time crushing dissent amid such a massive transfer of wealth to the degree, for example, as Senator Bernie Sanders pointed out the other day at the October 18th, 2025 demonstration in Washington, D.C., one individual in the United States, one individual who happens to be the world's richest individual, Elon Musk, owns more wealth than the bottom 50% of the population. Just for the record, the population of the United States is just under 350 million. One person versus half of the population. That is income inequality to an extreme degree, especially in a country with 37 million living below poverty. By the way, a country, again, as the senator from Vermont pointed out, a country that has the highest poverty level among children and the elderly. Okay. Now, another aspect of unitary executive theory is in engendering conformity through force, that is, using military police state tactics. Military police state tactics, for example, sending the National Guard, the immigration agents, Homeland Security people to cities, as the Trump administration has done, from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C., to Chicago, to Portland, Oregon, and they plan to do it to more cities, on the pretext of catching criminally legal immigrants who, by and large, they are nothing more, nothing less than workers. Are there criminals among immigrants? Of course there are, as there are criminals among the general population in any society, not just in the United States, not just in the rest of the world, but in the history of the world, in the history of civilization. Of course, that's true. But this is a pretext to crush dissent, because the crime of those working people is that they did not file the papers correctly, and anyone supporting them is also, by the way, targeted. Politicians or judges or anyone at all in the broader society supporting such people against military police state tactics is also a target. This is also part of hybrid authoritarianism, which means use of force rather than legal measures, due process, for example, very important, legal measures to achieve the goal. Another very important aspect is using unitary executive theory, using the powerful executive branch to remold the entire civil service sector and to send the signal to the state and local level, in the case of the United States, that this is what conformity looks like. We punish by dismissing people from their jobs and replacing them with those loyal. So creating a bureaucratic structure, and historically we have seen this. By the way, this is not just the United States. We have seen it, we see it in other countries today. Usually, by the way, these are traits of third world countries. And as I'll point out in a second, this is the sort of thing that is invariably identified with global South countries, East European countries, that is former Soviet Republic countries, where there is a thin veneer of democracy, which is identified with electoral politics minus social justice, minus adherence to the fundamental rights, human rights and civil rights of the citizens, of all citizens, not just the elites behind the government whose policies are designed to enhance those elites. And finally, there is the remolding. Another thing about hybrid authoritarianism is that there is a remolding of the subcultures through the hegemonic culture. Let me explain that jargon. The hegemonic culture basically is the culture that is determined by the elites to reflect their values, their ideology, their interests, and to justify their hegemony, their dominance over society, over the entire institutional structure. So hybrid authoritarianism remolds the culture in order to make authoritarianism the norm, have people accept it and say, well, I'll just go about my job. You know, whatever regime there is, I just have to feed my family. This is an interesting aside here. The one of the leftists in the resistance of the Italian fascist regime in the interwar period, Palmiro Togliatti, pointed this out, that he doesn't blame the people for securing a fascist card in order to get a job, because without that they wouldn't get the job. They had to become members of the fascist party, because their priority, and this is where Palmiro Togliatti disagreed with many on the left, their priority is to feed their family. People, in other words, do the Darwinist thing. That is, the instinct of survival takes over, and so they'll do whatever they need to survive. They're going to put aside any kind of dissent, because they know dissent means very fierce struggle just to survive. So these are some of the things that are very important here to consider as far as hybrid authoritarianism. And I should tell you, by the way, that in 2024, one of the organizations that keeps human rights organizations that keeps track of countries listed, out of 195 countries, 36 countries are listed as hybrid authoritarianism. The United States was not one of them, although the United States, by the way, is increasingly has traits that fit this mold. Usually, they put countries on there in the global south, from sub-Saharan Africa to Latin America to Asia, Turkey, India, former Soviet republics like Kazakhstan, for example. Okay, that's fine and dandy, but the question is, are there traits of hybrid authoritarianism in Germany, in the United Kingdom, in the United States? And this, today, especially in the United States, we see very clear evidence that indeed there is hybrid authoritarianism, especially when President Donald Trump and the Secretary of Defense Hegseth went before, on September 30th, a group of generals and admirals, and essentially said to them that the enemy is everywhere. It's not just outside the United States, it's inside. Now, when the government itself declares that there are domestic enemies, that is alarming. That the citizens of a country, at least a group of them that do not conform, although the Constitution provides for the right of dissent, okay? The founding fathers had the right of dissent as a guarantee. Okay, so when the president, the Secretary of Defense said, "Your job is to use our cities as training grounds," this, of course, was indeed alarming. The silence of the generals and the admirals, and not to mention afterwards some of the comments that came anonymously from some of these members of the Department of Defense, what they said with regard to loyalty to the Constitution, not loyalty to an individual. However, the answer also came on the 18th of October by at least 7 million people across the United States in between anywhere between 2,700 locations and 3,000, they spoke very loudly about the fact that they are interested in preserving an America that is as closely resembles the America of the founding fathers, an America of pluralism, an America of diversity, an America based on the principles of the Enlightenment in the 18th century of freedom and equality, liberal democratic principles, not autocratic principles. Okay, that is a reality. Now, in my view, and this is the theme of my session today, is that hybrid authoritarianism may not have serious limitations in Kazakhstan and in modern day Turkey. However, it has quite a few limitations in a country like the United States, which is a country of immigrants. It is a country where the Anglo-Saxon elites that established hegemony over this land that belonged to Native Americans and transported millions of Africans, reducing them to slavery up until the Civil War. A country that relegated second tier status to immigrants from the global south and southern Europe. This country is still a multicultural country, and it has deep roots in its subcultures, but also among some of the elites. Not all of the elites. There's been a lot of literature on this, both journal articles as well as scholarly material, newspaper articles, on whether the elites actually agree with this, or are they just going along because they realize the power of the state. The power of the state is indeed very important. Not only are they in charge of fiscal policy, corporate subsidies, bailouts, basically lobbying on behalf of US businesses on a world scale. The power of the state is vast. Regulatory measures, by the way, let's not forget, very important to businesses, regulatory measures. So they remain in the background. They may not agree because they have a lot of workers. Everyone from the high-tech sector, by the way, just look at the demographics of who works in the high-tech sector, to the hospitality sector. The society itself has very deep and complex roots in diversity and multiculturalism, and the consumer-based American economy rests on that foundation. And 3/4 of the US economy is rooted on that foundation. The US does not have a producer-geared economy like China, by the way, which is the world's factory. That's not the economy it has. Now, China is gradually transitioning toward more and more consumerism, but the US has for a long time been a consumer-driven economy. And the monolithic nature of hybrid authoritarianism undercuts that very economic structure. So this is one of the serious limitations, very serious limitations in the world's #1 economy, at least in nominal value, not in purchasing power parity. That's China, by the way. But that's a very important sign. Now, the United States, according to the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, sits at the very bottom when it comes to liberal democracy metrics. In every respect, from attacking free press, this is to give you an idea of the empirical evidence that exists by an organization like the OECD, hardly an organization hostile to the United States, by the way. This organization compiling statistics takes the metric, takes into account all the criteria, and comes up out of 36 countries, the US ranks 35th in terms of representation and 32nd in terms of rights to its citizens. That is not a good place when the elites in the country itself, including the media, by the way, and politicians from both political parties, this is not to exclude the Democrats because they helped the country get to hybrid authoritarianism, as we'll see, by the way. This is not to exclude the Democrats from responsibility for hybrid authoritarianism in the United States. But when a country like the United States ranks 32nd in the OECD members out of 36, that is a very bad place, and 35th, one level down from the last place. And this is in terms of representation, this is a very bad place to be. And this is indicative that on the basis of all the metrics, from arbitrary arrests at airports, from sending federal troops, National Guard and ICE agents and Homeland Security people to cities, to using the pretext of, again, like I said, of arresting criminals who are illegal aliens in the United States. That's a legitimate issue. It can be litigated in courts. But using raw military force and having this highly advertised session on the 30th of September with the generals sitting there stunned, by the way, and the admirals in this large auditorium, and they were told that besides being, of course, fat, they were also to be disciplined, and they were threatened that they would be, that they have to conform to this new reality of using cities as training grounds. This is stunning because, of course, one assumes that the role of the armed forces is for foreign engagement, not domestic. In any event, the arbitrary arrests, like I said, the attack on the labor unions, building more prisons than ever and more detention centers. Just for the record, the United States has the largest as a percentage basis prisoner population of all developed countries, by the way. The largest prisoner population of all developed countries. Punishing anyone and any institution, especially universities, but any institution, including medical institutions, that has any link or purpose of promoting multiculturalism, of promoting diversity, inclusion, equity, and inclusion. This is an all-out war against what has been the norm in a liberal democratic society from the founding fathers to today. However, this did not take place today. Trump, contrary to the theory that this is a cult of personality and it's all Trump's fault, that's nonsense. It is not. Trump did not create any of this. Trump found fertile ground on which he built and consolidated what he already found. That is it. Trump is symptomatic, and all the billionaires that make up the cabinet he has, and multimillionaires running the government, all these people are simply taking advantage of an institutional structure of hybrid authoritarianism, building very slowly, from the ashes of the Cold War through the neoliberal system under both political parties. Let me be very clear, both political parties pursuing the interests of Wall Street and the military industrial complex. This is not the fault of one individual. This is a structural problem. This is a problem of a bipartisan problem of both political parties. Now, in 1991, when the Harvard University professor, late Samuel Huntington, published a book on third wave democracy, essentially arguing that there is a new dawn. This is 91, more than a decade after the advent of the neoliberal system, the so-called Washington Consensus. It starts as an experiment, US-sponsored experiment in Chile under the military dictator Augusto Pinochet. Margaret Thatcher adopts it in England. Then the United States under Reagan consolidates it. The antecedents go back to Jimmy Carter in the late 70s, but it consolidates in the 80s. And in 91, Huntington publishes Third Wave Democracy, arguing there's a new dawn on our planet. Democracy is flourishing. First in the 1970s, beginning in 1974 with Portugal and Greece. Portugal in the spring, Greece in the summer. No more dictatorships in those two countries. In 75, Francisco Franco is over, transition to democracy there. And then in the 1980s, the flourishing of democracy in Latin America, with including, by the way, Brazil and Argentina. So we have democracy flourishing, according to Samuel Huntington, except that the transitioning from those dictatorships to electoral regimes took place under neoliberalism. And so those regimes, those elected regimes, and they were duly elected, by the way, those elected regimes in Samuel Huntington's theoretical model of third wave democracy grew under the umbrella, I should say, under the umbrella of a neoliberal political economy, which has the seeds of creating hybrid authoritarianism. And this does not leave out even the core countries in the world capitalist system, like the United States, Northwest Europe, Japan, right? So the core, the G7, the core countries included, they too move to incorporate as they adopt neoliberal measures. And as neoliberalism begins to get into a crisis, they move increasingly toward measures that some call illiberal, undemocratic, absent of social justice criteria. In fact, the word social justice, by the way, according to many authoritarian neoliberals, whether in governments in India or in Turkey, but also in the United States right now under this government, that's an anathema. That's a word that only Marxists use. Although, just for the record, I have to say this because I was a historian for a number of decades, and I used to teach the origin of the concept of social justice, and it is associated a great deal with the Catholic Church and a specific English philosopher who wrote in the early 16th century a book entitled Utopia, a Greek word which means no place, a philosophical work about what the problems were in the nascent period, in the embryonic stage of capitalism, what the problems were with society absent of social justice as the new commercial revolution and the evolving capitalist system was actually leaving the vast majority of the population behind. So social justice is very much in the Western world has been defined by Christians. Okay, so let's get that straight. Long before Marx, who comes in and Engels in 1848 during the European revolutions to write the Communist Manifesto. There was Thomas More, okay? And Thomas More was the one who defined the concept. Anyway, um, the problem with hybrid authoritarianism is not just the executive, because I mentioned um, the unitary executive theory and the courts, especially the Supreme Court, going along to enhance unitary executive theory, weaken the legislative branch, strengthen the executive. In other words, strengthen autocracy. Very dangerous, given that this is a violation of the balance between branches, the division, separation of branches, and the balance between branches. They check each other. And given that what it entails for public policy and executing the social contract that incorporates the interests and the well-being and the welfare of all people, not just the wealthy. Okay, not just what Senator Sanders and many others call the oligarchy. So this is a very important point to make, that the hybrid authoritarian system starts at the top, but then it filters down to the states. Because when you look at the reality in the United States, the states have also been very much involved in hybrid authoritarian policies in every respect, by the way, from education, okay, to the way that the state and local authorities, since the police are under local authorities, of course, state troopers in the United States as well, local authorities and state authorities use the police against their own citizens. Many states regimenting the right to free speech, the right to protest, okay? And not to mention, by the way, the manipulation of the electoral process in redistricting in the United States. Now, in the 250-year period of the United States, there have been cycles of rising strong executives and then cycles of reformers who argued that the country ought to adhere to the vision of the founding fathers. Certainly, the progressive movement that starts at the local level and the state level in the late 19th century in the United States in the 1890s, and then goes to the national level under Republicans and Democrats in the early 20th century. That was a reaction to what the GOP and the Trump administration officials like to celebrate as the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age was a dark age for American civilization, as it entailed the consolidation of the late 19th century oligarchy in society, controlling institutions across the board, by the way, while leaving behind marginalized populations, minorities, women. At that time, women did not have rights, by the way, did not have the right to vote. This is the start of the women's movement in the late 19th century, in the nascent period of the progressive movement. So what we have here is a reaction. Just like today, we have a reaction to hybrid authoritarianism. It is not the case that people take this sitting down. In the 1960s, it starts in the 1950s and then it explodes in the 1960s, the civil rights movement combined with the anti-war movement and the counterculture movement. So what we have is indeed another grassroots mass movement reacting to what a large segment of the population deems is the correct, at least the identity they want as an America for themselves, what they see as um, this the social contract envisioned by the founding fathers and what is taking place in reality, comparing the reality of a country moving increasingly toward autocratic practices, and then there is reaction, public reaction through mass movements. Unfortunately, the mass media, by the way, in its and this includes not just the media that agrees with hybrid authoritarianism and tries to make this the norm and tries to project this as a democracy, but also the liberal media, because the liberal media is still corporate media. Um, Billionaires own media outlets. Media outlets are not owned by some potato farmer in Idaho or some um, welder or some plumber in Chicago. They're owned by billionaires. The billionaire class has an interest in conformity of the masses, of the labor class, of the working class, and of the middle class to hybrid authoritarianism, because it is the ultimate goal is to preserve the privileges of the elites. The media presents the um, enemy as the implied enemy as those who dissent, and those come from the middle class and the working class, by the way. So class warfare, as all scholarly literature on neoliberalism points out, at least critical of neoliberalism, because there are those who are apologists of neoliberalism. Class warfare is an integral part of neoliberalism. It is an integral part. Warren Buffett, hardly someone who is hostile to capitalism, agreed that class warfare is something that was declared by capitalists. Workers did not declare any war on capitalists. Capitalists declared war on workers. Okay. And we see this when we look at the statistics of living standards of the last 45 years under neoliberalism, where the disparities rest when one person, I'll go back to this issue, one person owns more wealth than half of the American people. Okay. And yet, when labor unions ask for collective bargaining consolidation, because collective bargaining has been a target globally of neoliberals, attacking it, asking for better wages, more benefits, a stronger social safety net, which has been eroded, by the way, attacking Social Security, attacking Medicare, attacking Medicaid in the United States. We have seen in this latest bill, especially Medicaid, taking $1 trillion, as Sanders, again, I'll refer to Senator Sanders, he pointed out they took $1 trillion out of Medicaid and gave it to the richest 1%. Okay, that is why there are some, and I sort of agree, I agree and disagree there, and I'll explain this. That's why they have this distraction of making urban centers the enemy of America, sending troops, sending the National Guard, sending ICE to Chicago and creating chaos. The word that comes out of people's mouth, the ordinary American, is there's chaos here. When you look at FBI statistics and they indicate that crime is going down in cities like Chicago and in Washington, D.C., and when a judge in Portland, Oregon rules that there's no foundation that Portland has runaway crime to justify sending armed forces there to control violence. In fact, the FBI statistics indicate that in the last few decades, violence emanates, if we are going to be balanced about this, largely from far right-wing groups. Oddly enough, by the way, it has been reported in the media that some of the people in the far right, including Proud Boys, have been signing up to join some of these federal forces that crack heads of dissidents in urban centers and of immigrants and marginalized populations, and liberals and progressives supporting them, including, by the way, women, including priests. When the Speaker of the House was asked um, if attacking priests and clergy people from all faiths is a red line. He said that's not an issue. The real problem, he diverted immediately. He argued that the real threat to America doesn't come from officers attacking, pepper spraying priests, or manhandling women, throwing them on the ground, and so forth, or arresting. There was an interesting story just the other day: a blind young boy, blind, and manhandled and arrested. No, that's not the problem. The problem is, he pointed out, the people in Portland, Oregon, riding bicycles without clothing. That's a threat. Anyway, the contradiction in hybrid authoritarianism, which targets, by the way, also elites, not just the. It doesn't just target ordinary people. There have been high-profile individuals, from the former FBI director to a former national security advisor to Letitia James. In other words, James Comey, the former FBI director. Who's the other one? I can't remember his name. The former national security advisor to Trump, of all people, by the way, was also indicted. He's in court. The prosecutor of New York, who went after Trump on charges of corruption, she's been charged. And having an enemies list. Now, an enemies list in a democratic society by the head of state is a red flag. It shows that due process is not respected, that vengeance, political targeting of individuals on an enemies list is a sign of autocracy. It's not a sign of that's not a sign of democracy, by the way. This is the sort of thing, by the way, that the No King's Day exposed. The contradictions in all of this are that the society has been polarized, and although the hybrid authoritarian regime tries to project an image of unity in the name of strengthening the nation state, the question is, who gets to define what the national interest, by the way, an issue that came up during the French Revolution, when the Abbé Sieyès wrote an essay called "What is the Third Estate?" Who are we? What is France? Is it the king and the aristocracy and the upper clergy, in other words, the elites at that time in the 18th century, or is it the rest of the population? Where is the identity of the country? The United States in the 21st century is facing the exact same question. Who is the country? Is it Wall Street, the military industrial complex, and the political class, the establishment political class? That's the country. And to the detriment of the rest of the population. So the country, the rest of the population is sacrificing itself so that those people retain their privileges. The exact same problem that existed during the French Revolution, by the way. In 1789, they faced the same problem, that the future of their country hung in the balance. Now, as Democratic Senator Chris Murphy has recently stated, that authoritarianism, now I call it hybrid authoritarianism, he argued that authoritarianism um, isn't coming, that the authoritarian takeover isn't coming. It's here now, he stated. I don't go as far as that. I think that there are enough remnants of the democratic process. And I believe that there are enough governors and mayors and judges, and there are enough among the social elites who are opposed to hybrid authoritarianism to make sure that it does not get out of hand, and that it is indeed contained. So the reason that, again, the theme of this session is that there are limits to hybrid authoritarianism, is that the Jeffersonian democracy model of Thomas Jefferson in 1787 stipulated that, and I'll quote this, the tree of liberty, he stated, must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure. The vision of democracy, liberal democracy, Jefferson, by the way, was influenced by the English philosopher John Locke and by the French social democratic philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So he had both of those influences, and his vision of democracy was that it is an experiment that must be constantly refreshed, and that, of course, it's going to require sacrifices on the part of the people who want to preserve it. I believe that there are systemic obstacles to hybrid authoritarianism. And I believe that there are systemic articles to hybrid authoritarianism also because institutionally, whether in the United States, but especially in the United States, or in India, which is predominantly Hindu, but has one of the largest Muslim populations in the world, by the way. Muslim minority and the Hindu nationalists are targeting, using the Muslims as a pretext to impose authoritarian liberalism under Modi over there. Okay. Same thing in Turkey, using Islam, just the opposite of India. They're using Hinduism against Islam. In Turkey, Islam to consolidate internally among conservative forces so they can go along with neoliberal policies that favor the Turkish oligarchy. I think that there are enough remnants, there are enough institutional structures in society that will preserve some semblance of democracy. It will be weaker, and every time there is an attack on democracy, I agree with Thomas Jefferson, it constantly needs to be refreshed. He was absolutely right, because democracy is a dynamic system. It's ever changing. It does need, as he pointed out, that natural manure of reform. It has to reform itself, to rejuvenate. And it does mean sacrifice on those institutions and the people who believe in the system. However, I also believe that hybrid democracy, and this is very important as far as I'm concerned, contains the seeds of its own destruction. I think that a lot of what the aspects of hybrid democracy entail have to do with arrogance of power, with greed, and with sociopathic behavior, to be honestly. Uh, and again, I'm speaking as objectively as I can based on studies by psychiatrists and psychologists on political elites and social elites, which indicate that they have a much higher percentage of psychological problems than the rest of the population, and that they externalize the hostilities as of that psychological imbalance that is entertained in their minds, and far more delusions, especially of grandeur, and the desire to shape the world according to their vision, to the detriment of society. So, what we have, however, is that these people have no red lines of whom they will attack. They, for example, we see among them historically, not just today, whether in the US or in India or in Turkey or whatever, or in Kazakhstan, we see, or in Hungary under Viktor Orban, we see that they also go after their own people. We also see that inadvertently, in trying to conduct public policy in order to benefit one group of people to the detriment of others, there is a tendency of backfiring. For example, let's take tariffs in the case of the United States under Trump. Tariffs have repeatedly backfired for the United States, whether from the first Trump administration to, and sanctions to Biden, by the way, who was a Democrat, had nothing to do with Trump, a Democrat. They backfire. They hurt the very interests that supposedly they should help, and they hurt society as a whole, and they aggravate. They may have one benefit over here to a specific narrow segment of the economy, but overall they're detrimental, as they are a burden to the entire economy, especially to the mass consumer who pays for them, by the way. For that, there is no serious economist who disagrees. So the question, of course, is where is the U.S. headed with all of this? I do not believe that the United States is undergoing social discontinuity. I disagree with some of the scholarly work on this. I do not, nor do I believe that the United States is headed for a rebellion. I also disagree with that. In fact, some labeled this the June No King's Day and the October No King's Day demonstrations and protests and so forth as a rebellion. It's not a rebellion. The word revolution, by the way, simply means systemic change, because you can have a scientific revolution. In other words, there is systemic change in the domain of science. Revolution, when we're talking about political revolution, simply means systemic change in the regime. There is no evidence that the United States is undergoing any kind of revolution. It is undergoing in grassroots endeavors for restoring liberal democracy. It is not true that this is the project of a Hungarian Jewish billionaire who is progressive and sympathetic, namely George Soros, that the Democrats, that the Republicans want targeted and exiled back to Hungary, and all sorts of other things they're going to do to him. But this is not to say that George Soros has not in the past helped fund progressive causes, democratic causes around the world. He's a billionaire, by the way, so we know in practice he's a capitalist. He makes money the old-fashioned way within the capitalist system. Now, when you look at when we deconstruct the grassroots movement, whether it is in the United States or anywhere in the world, the Generation Z movements from Madagascar to Nepal to Indonesia to Peru to Morocco, wherever they are, the young people's movement, which draw in other people against neoliberalism, against autocracy, against corruption. Invariably, by the way, I neglected, and I apologize for not mentioning this earlier, invariably hybrid authoritarian regimes are riddled in corruption. They're swimming in corruption. Okay, and I mean on a large scale. And what happens is that the state has the privilege of overlooking such corruption and focusing on small scale individual crimes, let's say misdemeanors, theft here, family squabbles, family in neighborhood crime, and so forth, small time crime, rather than large scale money laundering, for example, stock market manipulation, currency manipulation, tax fraud, tax evasion, large crime, billions of dollars moving on a world scale. That using real estate to cover, engaging to cover up money illegally gotten, real estate transactions. These are the large that conceal money illegally acquired. This is the reality. This is the reality. And so what we have is indeed a situation where hybrid authoritarianism has systemically at its core decadence and corruption. And force is the only way to camouflage that and to have the population accept that as the norm. Okay, this is the norm. Go about your life. Otherwise, there are consequences. And I said, and like I said earlier, I accept the Palmiro Togliatti thesis of why I understand perfectly why a average person, middle class, worker, goes about their work and gets up in the morning, goes to work to feed the family. And that's the priority. That should be their priority. Togliatti was absolutely correct. They're not going to bother with it. So they do whatever they want, whatever, not whatever they want, they work whatever they can, and they'll go along. And mechanically, they'll go along. The caveat here is whether hybrid authoritarianism that exists now in a number of countries, and not just in global South, former Soviet republics, not just in those countries, but actually has crept into the G7. Whether hybrid authoritarianism continues to dilute liberal democracy to such a degree where we will no longer be able to disagree that indeed it is a form of authoritarianism in policy because it lacks any evidence of social justice and commitment to pluralism and inclusiveness of all citizens, not just the oligarchy of each country concerned. I thank you very much for watching. I ask you to please ask questions, write comments, and by all means, join this channel. Thank you very much.